Yeah. Um, I'll talk about why I didn't get back to him, but holy smokes. I should have been back to him long ago.
Yeah, it's one of those things when Gilda brought it up, you brought it up, and then your lineage, where the same mater, that just came around and went, time to take the baton. It was just a relay race. There was nothing to do except take the baton and run with it.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna say good morning to people. YouTube.
Good morning.
Are attracting 6 so far, just in that 1 minute. Okay, folks, so we're here. Hi, Neil. Nice to see you. Today we're going to talk about something a little bit different because it seems like it's not been properly discussed in general. Okay, so this 2 weeks ago or so, one of our friends from our Tarot group brought up the topic of Ezra Pound. Now, it happens that as Jordan was just saying to me, I have a bit of a lineage about Ezra Pound. And it's very interesting to me, some of the parallels to my own life that he has. It's interesting to me that he was basically a kid from Idaho who ended up going to Hamilton College. And I can't even imagine how that possibly happened. But it's my alma mater. And so when I was there, hi Annette, nice to see you. When I was there, as Jung used to say, Pound was in the air. Okay. And the very first thing that they did on the welcome dinner of my freshman year was they had a poetry reading by a literature professor who was quite old. He was emeritus at the time, named Bobo Rudd. And holy smokes, what was Olga's last name? Speaking of that, just a minute. Okay, so anyway, okay, Olga Rudge. Okay, so it's not the same last name. He had children by 2 women. One was Olga and one was Dorothy. And I think he finally was married to Dorothy. And among other things, when he was incarcerated in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, Dorothy writes to James Laughlin, who was his publisher, ultimately, and tells Laughlin to send all royalties to Olga anyway, so they were quite a menage a trois. And so anyway, this week I have gotten, because I wanted to go back and see something about this guy. I wasn't remembering. I got the selected letters between Ezra Pound here and James Laughlin. And let me first talk about my lineage. So when I was at Hamilton College, I didn't have the luxury of being the man of leisure studying, because when I got there, I thought it was pretty hot stuff. I'd been the top student in two of my high school classes, which were English and Problems of Democracy. And I had been a member of the National Honor Society and the International Quill and Scroll, which is an honor society for journalists. And so I get to Hamilton, not quite grokking the fact that everybody at Hamilton was a member of the National Honor Society and president of the class or something like that. Right?
Minimum. Yeah, minimum.
Minimum. And so one of the first things that this sophomore, this older man, said to us, he had a pipe and he seemed so old and mature, said to us during orientation was, well, for the next 4 years, you're men of leisure, quote unquote. And wow, that really set me in the wrong direction because I didn't study hard the first few weeks. And I just expected to sail through like I had sailed through in high school. And all of a sudden I had difficult grades, and at Thanksgiving time, I was in an auto accident. Fortunately, I was not driving, but I was in an auto accident in which one of my classmates was killed going down to Washington for Thanksgiving weekend. And so, and then the following week, when I was back at Hamilton, I was working as the kitchen helper in the kitchen to earn a little money at Hamilton. And one of my jobs was to, every Saturday night, we served steak, actual steak. And, you know, they were probably pretty bad cuts because I remember they were tough as hell. But anyway, so that job had to be done out on the loading dock of the college, or the commons, where we had the kitchen and where everybody, the freshman class, ate. In the upper classes, you got to eat in fraternity houses, but in the freshman class, you all had to eat together in this huge room, and which was called Commons. And so if you've ever seen a picture of Oxford, you know, welcoming a new class, there's a depiction of that in Chariots of Fire, for example. You'll know what this room was like. And you're looking up like, is my room like that?
Well, no, I was like, I'm trying to figure out a way so I don't have like these black vampire eyes with the lights in here, but it's not working. So anyway, go.
No, you're right. You're right.
It's funny though, but when you said that, I looked up and I see the Gothic arches, because Chariots of Fire from back in the 80s. And
right. So anyway, I was out on the loading dock, and it was bitter cold. It was the week after Thanksgiving, and in upstate New York, it starts snowing the first week of October, and it doesn't give up until, as my father used to say, until you were on your knees in June. And so,
right.
So I'm out there cooking the steaks outside to give them a flavor, right? And the loading dock door opened, and it was very cold outside. I don't know what the temp was, but for some reason I put my hand on the door jamb, and the wind came along and blew this loading dock door. And you can imagine what a loading dock door is like. Mm-hmm. And it had a flange for weather stripping that was like this, right, out of metal along the edge of the door. And so I had, and the male side of that was on the building itself, and the female was on the door. And so this door slammed shut, and it was about 100-pound door at least,
Big
and
door, right?
it got my middle finger. I got trapped in the door right here, and I don't know if you can see that, but I still have a scar in there from when that happened. And,
Crushed it. Yeah.
pardon?
Just crushed it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it cut halfway through my finger, actually. And there was nothing I could do. I don't even remember what happened after that. I know I was in great pain, and the next day I went to the infirmary. So I'd been in this auto accident, and then all of a sudden I had this huge white splinter on my finger, and so it looked like I was giving people the finger, right?
Right.
and I was in a lot of pain. And the upshot of it was that at Christmas, when Christmas came around and we were leaving the campus for a week and a half, we had a party, and my roommate and I drank a fifth of Johnny Walker Red Label in half an hour. Okay, my roommate and I drank a fifth of Johnny Walker Red.
That's not messing around.
In half an hour. And man, it was making me feel a lot better. But I do remember at one point in that evening hugging the urinal. But so anyway, the upshot of it was that I wasn't in real good shape psychologically at the end of my first semester of college. And the result was I came back to campus and blew all my exams and got 4 Ds and a C. So I ended up on academic probation. And fortunately, and my parents were in Japan, so they couldn't support me. And my grandparents were nearby, and I spent the holiday with them. But I have very little memory of that holiday. And so anyway, I got 4 Ds and a C, and I got on academic pro, which really surprised me. And man, I was in the doghouse. And so,
well, you know what's ironic about that is that the middle finger astrologically symbolizes balance and responsibility, and it's ruled by Saturn.
Oh, geez.
Saturn basically came in and went whack.
Yeah, sort of waking me up.
Yeah, exactly.
And so later on in my college career, I made it a goal to be the most improved student, because I knew at graduation there was an award for the most improved student. Unfortunately, I was probably second in that because I didn't win the prize, but
you didn't fail hard enough initially, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
They got 5 Ds instead of 4 Ds and a C.
Right. Something like that. And so anyway, I had a history professor, an Asian history professor, who was my advisor, and he just grabbed me by my throat and just guided me through the second semester. And he was very close to me for the rest of his life. But anyway, we're talking about Ezra Pound. So Ezra Pound. So in that time, my objective was to figure out how to survive the Vietnam War. That was topmost in my mind. And a lot of people were being in the classes of 67 and 68, or 66, 67, 68, those classes, and to a certain degree, 65, were being drafted. Now, the head waiter my freshman year, who was working with me in the kitchen, of course, had been a senior named John W. Foreman Jr., and he ducked getting drafted by going to India in the Peace Corps for 2 years. And he was relatively a neighbor of mine in Casanova, New York, where my grandparents lived. And so we were quite close. And, then John went off to the Peace Corps, and I was trying to imagine what it was like for him to be in India in the Peace Corps. And he came back in 67 and promptly got drafted. And so he went to Army infantry school then to avoid being a trooper. And he went to Vietnam and got killed. One of the 3 men of my class, we only had 180 who died in Vietnam, or not my class, but from my college who died in Vietnam. But anyway, the objective was to avoid getting drafted and ended up being a private in the Army, and especially because I was a Navy junior. I didn't want to go in the Army, and so I was very logos oriented at that time. I was just focused on how do I graduate and how do I get through here so that I can, survive. And one of the things that I got offered in my junior year was that the Marine Corps had a program that I could join in March of my junior year. And if I became a Marine Corps officer, then they would defer my active duty for 2 years until I was a first lieutenant and let me go to graduate school, which I wanted to do in Asian studies. And so I didn't pay much attention to literature, I have to tell you. And so Ezra Pound was just kind of a name that was floating through my college all the time because he had been there. And meanwhile, much later in my life, I learned that, or I realized, about 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago, I realized that Carl Jung had been very close to the Mellons, Paul Mellon, who was the banker, and Paul's wife, and this was in the 1930s, and Paul's wife was the major mover of the Bollinger Foundation, and which first published the collected works of C.G. Jung in English. And so and her middle name was Conover, Mary Conover Mellon, and she had been so close to C.G. Jung in the 30s that in 1939, when the war in Europe had begun, I think this is around October of 1939, the last letter that Carl Jung wrote before the mail was cut off in Switzerland was to Mary Mellon, and then of course she died in 1944. Okay, so meanwhile, Paul was still supporting the Bollinger Foundation, and he gave $100,000 to the Library of Congress to make a $10,000 a year award to an American poet. So meanwhile, Ezra Pound, he got fed up with America. And I'll read a couple passages of this book, which are truly a hoot. And he, immediately after World War I, had gone to England, where he became a critic and a sort of a publisher of poetry and that sort of thing. And then I think about 1924, he moved to Rapallo, Italy. And he was there for the next 20 years. And somehow he got caught up in some fascist crap, something like the way Jung had been caught up in it. in the early 30s. And he ended up doing some broadcasts for Mussolini. And he actually wrote a book called Jefferson and Mussolini. And Jefferson and Mussolini. And so anyway, in 1943, he had done broadcasts very much like Tokyo Rose. A lot of people know Tokyo Rose, and he had done broadcasts out of Rome for the Axis. And so in 1943, he was indicted for treason, and he was still in Italy, of course. And when the war was over, the Allies went in and arrested him, and they wanted to try him for treason. Well, the problem was that he had supported T.S. Eliot and E.E. Cummings and a lot of very, very prominent poets in the teens and ever since throughout his career. He had supported these guys, in addition to being an author, a very prolific author himself. And he's also very famous for having translated from the Chinese the Analects of Confucius.
Right, yeah.
Right. And so that's another thing, that I ended up in the Marine Corps studying Chinese for a year, which kept me out of Vietnam for a year. So that was good, because my roommate, who didn't stay out, was killed 5 months after we graduated from the basic school. But instead of that, I went into the artillery and then into this language school program. So I didn't go for about 18 months after we'd finished the basic school, or after I had finished college. So I was a first lieutenant by the time I went to Vietnam. But anyway, the primary motivation for all of that was to stay alive until the Vietnam War was over. That was the main reason that I got in the first place. And I got in because the Marines had offered this 2-year sabbatical right at the beginning to go to graduate school. Except in February of 1968, which was my graduation year, Tet of 68 occurred in Vietnam, and 500 lieutenants were killed in 1 week. And the result of that was I got this nice letter saying, well, you're lieutenant, you're sorry about your graduate school, but you're on active duty as of June the 12th. And here are your orders to report to the basic school. And as it happened in the fullness of time, I actually got the equivalent of graduate school and probably better than I would have if I'd gone to a graduate program, because I got, an intensive language training in Chinese. But Ezra Pound I don't know how the hell this kid from Idaho became a Chinese scholar, but he did. And
well, something about that, I was thinking when you mentioned that earlier, it never stuck out to me before, but when you mentioned it, there's that kind of farm boy, small town mentality where, it's boots are for snakes and BS, and sometimes they come from the same person, and so they see through crap, but also the discipline is insane. And because, the farm will kill you, you're changing a tractor tire with the spring on the jack turn, you have to be careful, because if it kicks back, it'll literally take half your head off.
And that's right. And I was driving a tractor. Well, here's what happened. My father got stationed in Kalamazoo, Michigan, as inspector of naval shipbuilding after we came back from Alaska. And so for 3 years, I ended up living on a fruit farm
there you go.
It was basically a grape farm in Paw Paw, Michigan, of all places. And it was extremely rural. And so I was 10 years old and I got to drive the tractor and I got to go pick the asparagus with the other farm kids and that stuff. And I had a girlfriend at that time when I was in the 4th grade who got close to me. And because she got close to me, her family got close to a lawyer and his family who lived on the lake in Papua. There's a small man-made lake there. And so we had gotten to know that family right away because my father wanted to have a sailboat on this lake. And so the weirdness of that family, or not the weirdness, but the tragedy of that family was that the 12-year-old girl had polio, had gotten polio, and I don't know if she survived later on. I mean, she had survived it, and she was having trouble walking and stuff. I remember when I knew her, she was a little older than I was, but but her brother, her younger brother, was my brother's age, and he was a hemophiliac. Sheldon Jr. And so he was a hemophiliac, and I didn't know what that meant. And it was the time of Daniel Boone and all that crap. So one time I conned my brother and Shelley into becoming blood brothers, and I had a knife.
Here comes the hand.
And I decided to slice Shelley's wrist to make my brother and Shelley blood brothers. And oh man, the world came in on me in that moment.
Bleeder. Yeah.
Well, and of course I didn't know anything about hemophilia at the time. But anyway, Shelley had hemophilia, and 2 years later, after we had left Papua and moved on, where did we go? We went to Casanova, my hometown, for a year while my father went to the Med. But Shelley had gotten friendly with this farm family that had been my anima, my 4th grade anima friend, right? And so Shelley was on a tractor. It's not funny. Shelley was on a tractor and he fell off of it and started to have internal bleeding, and nobody knew what had happened, and he died when he was 12 years old.
Wow.
And obviously that was very numinous moment. But anyway, so I was a farm boy in part. Okay, not really that much, but here and there, I was a farm boy, and so I went to Hamilton College, which is really the main people intake at Hamilton was young men that were destined to become doctors and lawyers and dentists for Central New York. Okay, so they would come to Hamilton for a classical education, and then they would go off to medical school or whatever. And that's what happened to most of my class. But my family business was the military, and so we were in this Vietnam War thingy at the time. And by the way, John Foreman, who died after being in the Peace Corps, his father was the Episcopal Bishop of Syracuse. And so anyway, long story to get around how much my life sort of paralleled Ezra Pounds, it turns out.
Well, if I can just run a short ring orbit,
sure,
to pick your brain for your perspective. I mean, I grew up in North Texas. I mean, we're kind of, my dad would always refer to the mesquite tree as the Texas bonsai. you know, and you know, it's but what's interesting about the farm boy, farm girl mentality is there's really no BS, except they can think so deeply because their world is so expansive. You know, the big skies, the wide horizons. And with the no BS piece, there's also a conservatism that I find runs deep at the heart, that has a real predilection towards fascism or anti-fascism. I mean, so it really lives on the extremes. I mean, from your perspective, in that farm boy, does that resonate? Because there's just this kind of people take a stand, and they don't take a stand on the fence, you know, and because you fall off the fence and you land on the barbed wire. But I mean, does that resonate with you?
Oh yeah, surely.
Like Ezra then comes into Hamilton, and he may have been a little starry-eyed, but there's also the farm boy going, but this is just really neat. And
well, and this was 1904, mind you.
Yeah. So
and for example, Hamilton had a number of famous people who had gone there, including Elihu Root, who became Secretary of State,
right.
And actually and won the Nobel Peace Prize also, Elihu Root did. And so, I mean, it was quite a prominent school at that time. And was before all the state universities had sort of made a pablum of university education.
Right.
It was back still when there was I'm just checking some. Okay, so anyway, I wanted to share with you a couple of things that are in this book.
That's a good point too, about before the pablum of the university. I mean, that 1994 is a different time. It's a different time.
Right. Right, where's this piece? Anyway, okay, so there's a lot of good passages here, but anyway, Ezra Pound, that was his background, right? It was a very traditional education at the time I went there still, and it had 12 requirements, so you had to, take 2 of this and 8 of this and so on. And so one of the things that we had to do was take French or some language for 3 years or qualify for it. So I had taken 3 years of high school French, and that bought me exactly 1 semester at Hamilton. So I had to take 2.5 more years of high school French. By the way, Nancy's here, and also Annette.
Hey, Nancy.
And so it was quite rigorous in that sense. So it was the classic European style of education, and that kind of ended with my class. When I graduated, they actually created a women's coordinate college across the street, which lasted 10 years. And then the women were admitted to Hamilton 10 years later. But we had all this classical education that was required. And it was quite highbrow. And so my little National Honor Society from Kinnick High School in Japan was just chump change for that place.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, going into college, my stepmother taught at the Sorbonne for 6 years, and so she said, the one thing we're going to do is this orientation is we're going to skip a bunch of the stuff they want you to go to. I've signed you up for all these CLEP tests. And I'm like, what's a CLEP test? It's like, and it's basically testing out of English, trig, geometry, analytical geometry. So I did. And then 2 weeks after that, they changed all the math requirements. And so none of that was necessary. And I end up in this, stupid kiddie calculus class called business math. And I found it actually harder than calculus because it was so boring. And, but it's that kind of, I get it, where there's kind of a highbrow piece to it.
Right. So anyway, Ezra Pound was brought back to the U.S. in irons because he had made these broadcasts, and of the broadcasts, apparently all but two of them became official U.S. policy. What he was saying in his broadcast actually became official U.S. policy, but two of them were off color for some reason, which I don't know yet, and I'm not sure I care. But so anyway, they bring him back to the U.S. and he has sponsored all these very famous intellectuals for the previous 40 years, or not 40, but 30 years, and they incarcerate him in this mental hospital for the criminally insane so they didn't have to try him for treason. And so part of this book, which I'm reading now, is Ezra Pound and James Laughlin. James Laughlin was 30 years younger than Pound. He was born, he was 40, Pound was 48 when he met James Laughlin, who was 18. And keep in mind that James Laughlin later became his publisher. Okay. And I just got a copy of the Cantos today or yesterday. And it's New Directions Publishing which is Laughlin's press, that published the Cantos, among many other things. And Pound had made lots of money, or enough money, I guess, because he had translated Confucius and several other big Chinese folks at a time when nobody knew Chinese, right? So
and Analects and the classics and the Analects, I mean, they became the staple and like Columbia and other universities of that level, where if you wanted to be somebody, that's what you needed to study.
Right. And one of the things that's of interest, Pound was in this insane asylum for 12 years, and people were trying to get him out. And he was corresponding with them. And so in this book, there's one very brief letter between Laughlin. This is Laughlin writing to Pound, and he says, and by the way, the two of them for 30 years had referred to T.S. Eliot as Possum. So Laughlin says, Possum has written, they say, a very nice piece about your works and influence, which will be published in Poetry, that's Poetry Magazine, before long. They're devoting a special section to you to counteract all the bunk that the surf crowd have been putting out. Now, the surf crowd, that's Bennett Cerf. And so there's, all through this book, there are references underneath each letter to who they were talking about. And like it's a who's who of the 20th century intellectual life. So in the footnote, it says Bennett Cerf, 1898 to 1971, co-editor of the Saturday Review and president of Random House. had published the fact that he was cutting Ezra Pound's poems from Conrad Aiken's anthology because of Ezra Pound's anti-Semitism, which was debated later on, but anyway, whatever. So Cerf later printed a retraction of this because of the outcry from poets across the country. Cornell indicated to Cerf that because Ezra Pound had not been proved guilty of treason, Cerf's statements, quote, a contemptible betrayer of his country, unquote, was libelous. And that's from a book by Cornell. I don't know who Cornell is, or it might be Cornell Press, but anyway.
That started to turn the tide too, where now that's not war crime, it becomes libel, simply because of the legal jurisdiction not enacting anything further.
Yeah, and letter, so that comes from the book called The Trial of Ezra Pound, right, from New York, John Day, 1966. So 1966 was while I was in college.
Just a touchstone of that letter was a milestone right in the moment of no, this is not treason anymore. This is libel. And at that point, it stood him back up, basically.
Right. And so, on the back of the book, there's a quote here, a couple of quotes. One is, communicate, damn it. If I can't get any news, how can you get any, quote unquote. Right. And then another quote, the important thing is for the first time to emphasize the articulation of the thought. And then another quote, until a man will look at the truth and stop dodging even certain charity, or I'm not sure what he means by this, capital XTN is the word, is the non-word.
Extension?
Huh?
Extension?
Okay.
Even or extent, is it extent charity or charity extension?
I don't know, something like it. Charity does not tell you to condone this continuance, pardon on repentance, not before. And then the last one, too bad nobody tried to correct my errors with reason and fact, but only with the usual brainwash. So it's quite ribald, and it's quite obvious that from these letters that that Pound was not crazy at all.
Well, and going against the establishment, what's interesting about, I think, collinear around that time, J.R.R. Tolkien, there was one of his texts, I'm trying to remember the title, that the publisher tried to edit, and it was dwarfs versus dwarves in terms of plural. And his response was something that reminds me of Ezra Pound, that he would say was, J.R.R. Tolkien said, because their reasoning was that in the Oxford English Dictionary, it would be the plural dwarves. And he said, I wrote the Oxford English Dictionary, do not correct me. and that's kind of, Ezra Pound would just kind of pull out the 6-gun shooter off his waist, and bam, it was that talk about analyzing the truth. He was pretty. Oscar Wilde made a comment that if you're going to tell the truth, make people laugh or they will kill you. Mm-hmm. And he just didn't care about the laughter part, right? So pardon the aside, but that seemed to be.
No, that's quite all right. So anyway, I've started to go back through this, and of course, if you go into this work, if you're not reading about it instead of actually reading his work, it's quite difficult. Okay, it's like James Joyce, and I realized that there's actually another book called The Letters Between Ezra Pound and James Joyce.
Well, yeah, I remember someone brought up in honors poli-sci in college, Ezra Pound, and the professor just went like this. That's a whole semester just to start. and went back right to the syllabus. But whoever that was, I never thought about that till just now. I remember looking over, my dad likes Ezra Pound, is what I'm thinking. But then the professor's response was so priceless. Like, okay, you just opened up a door. We're not going to go through that door.
Yeah. Yeah, there was another one that he said about how, which I didn't find here. I wanted to read to you, but I can't find it. But anyway,
and Ezra Pound he relates both to the mystical path less traveled than religious but not religious, because I mean his path is so undeniably and unabashedly and unashamedly his own.
Yes,
and
precisely.
There is quite a zeal and discipline required to do that without receiving a target on your chest. And he, even though he got, held so much in the establishment wrestling match, he never got 3-point pinned. And, so he held out, and there's that Idaho farm boy. It's like, if I'm still breathing, I'm a problem, he might say.
And the reason this all resonates with me is, of course, because I've fought the banks for basically 10 years.
Right. The establishment piece was such, when you mentioned that in the beginning, I went, that's quite a dovetail, which then I laughed that you had the dovetail that took your Saturn finger.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so that's been an interesting week. I'm halfway through the book, but I was able to buy it secondhand, so it didn't cost me much to get it. And
I always love when I get a secondhand book, but the notes are in pencil, because I can I disagree, erase. It's like
well, yeah. In my case, I try to buy secondhand books that haven't been marked yet, which is what this was, and now it's been marked, of course.
Been marked.
And I'm going to send my marked version on to Tim and ask him to take a look at my markings only, and then pass it on to John Jackson, who's our psychiatrist friend, too.
And he's doing the Rilke group too, and Rilke along a different vein, but Rilke's poem, The Panther, is maybe one of the shortest poems that's the most dense and powerful. I mean, you can feel the life dying and in the eyes. And that's, to me, one of the primary pieces of Ezra Pound's work is the living and the dying. I mean, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, even, he's stripped down to being able to express eros with logos. I mean, the clarity is impeccable, but the depth and density is astounding.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is that Pound came out of Hamilton, because by the time I got there was freshman English, and in freshman English, the requirement was that within one semester you had to get 2 yes essays, and a yes essay was an essay that contained no punctuation errors and no spelling errors. And of course, the punctuation piece was at the whim of the professor,
which is that's arguably grammatically political. It's an opinion in a lot of places,
right?
Just like positive comma versus no comma.
Right.
I mean,
so in the first semester, I don't think I got a yes essay in the first semester. You got 4 chances each semester, and one of the 4 was always in the final exam. So I did get 1 in the second semester, And then I was into the exam, and it was, succeed or die. So you're writing Dick and Jane went up the hill, period.
Period. Yeah. Avoid the commas, no compound sentences,
Right.
certainly no semicolons or dashes.
Right. So here's what Pound says. He's in St. Elizabeth's, and he's responding to Laughlin. He says, "God damn and bugger the punctuation. The important thing is for the first time to emphasize the articulation of the thought."
Well, and he's going back to his Chinese. He's going back to Latin, where it's a concept language, not a word language.
Right.
But at the same time, he's being hilarious. I mean, I remember something with grammar like that, and I think I went, "God damn it!" As I start to walk out of my dad's office because I wasn't getting a yes on this essay, and so I never thought about this. But he goes, "Hold on. Contrary to popular belief, God's last name's not damn it." And I'm just going, you just flunked me out of this paper. I have to go back and, remove all this blood and rewrite it because the commas. But yeah, so I love that right there. Could you read that quote again?
Oh God, I think I went. Wait a minute. Let me find it again. It's not far. I just turned the page because I was looking for something else.
Because earlier I said, he didn't care much about the humor. He went straight for the truth. But then that's not true, because that's one of those places where his humor was just biting.
Yeah. Okay, so this is 1946 is the date. It's the 165th letter in this series. And it's from Ezra Pound at St. Elizabeth's to John Laughlin. And it says, "God damn and bugger the punctuation. The important thing," and this is in poetic form here, so you can see it's how it's set up. Okay, a poem is supposed to have one idea in each line. So he was writing everything poetically. And so he says, "The important thing is," line one, second line, "for the first time," third line, "two," fourth line, "emphasize," fifth line, "the articulation of the thought."
Well, and there's got to be be careful of the poor man's grammar is a poem with one period. Jack ran through the forest, but with a poem, you get the inherent pause, and you don't spend any mental real estate on the comma. And so, but what's interesting is I've found too that if you write out in a positive sentence, a compound sentence, but you break it up like versing or phrasing in a poem, people get the compound sentence because they're forced to pause. The problem is when they run too far into the forest of this compound sentence, they get lost because they're expecting that one idea for the whole sentence, whereas it's one idea per line in the poem.
Yeah, and of course, I suffered through English classes in high school where they insisted on diagramming sentences.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just read it through one more time. "The important thing is, for the first time, to emphasize the articulation of the thought." That's what he cared about, obviously.
And not get lost in the Mickey Mouse of basically the policy of your own personal semantics. I mean, in that case, semantics becomes some antics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Just state of the idea instead of getting into a right-left fight about how the idea is finished and polished. And he didn't care what your shoes look like or your pedigree.
Okay, so here's a reference to Chinese. I marked this page. He says, this is a footnote, Matthew's Chinese English Dictionary, 1969, which Ezra Pound used. It's also the one I used. And it is get it across. For example, Confucius says, get the meaning across. And then he puts in brackets, and then stop in caps. Stop in caps. The Great Digest. And I guess it's in the Analects because it's the unwobbly pivot. And it's translation commentary by Ezra Pound in his, and then.
So quick question to kind of on point, get the meaning across, comma, and stop, or get the meaning across and stop, no comma?
Well,
or did they switch lines?
No, I mean, the sentence is actually get the meaning across, comma, in the Great Digest, the unwobbly pivot, the Analects.
Okay.
And but in parentheses it says get the meaning across and then stop.
Right. There's the remove the additional encyclopedic reference to, you can take out the additional information between the commas basically, and then the sentence runs out without one.
He makes a good comment here about St. John's here in Annapolis. We have the third oldest college in the United States here in Annapolis. It's called St. John's College, and they teach from the great books, which means that if you're going to study physics, you have to study Isaac Newton in the original. And it's a very classical European education, right? But he's commenting on it. The St. John's reading list emphasis on classics good. And then he puts in parentheses, the curriculum of St. John College is based on the great books selected mostly by Mortimer Adler, but Marx and no Prudhomme or Brother Adams admit no competence in Oriental. Right. There's nothing Oriental about the great books and about what St. John's does. I know a little bit about it. But anyway, it's an interesting little college we have here across from the Naval Academy. It's kind of like, there's only one sport that the Naval Academy and St. John's engage in, and that is croquet. and one
certainly not the Army Navy game.
Pardon?
Certainly not the Army Navy game.
No, and once a year they have a famous croquet match,
right,
where the women come in long dresses a la the 19th century, and the men come in
the brimmed hats, and
skimmer hats and spats, right?
Right.
So it's kind of fun. And Thomas Dennis says Pound's support of Italy has, alas, always put me off his poetry and other works, and probably put me off it until now. Okay, because I haven't looked at it really. I knew that he existed, and as I say, he was like smoke through the air at Hamilton when I was there. But I think he got a bum rap, and like Thomas Dennis, I got put off him because I was this Logos Marine colonel, lieutenant colonel, and he had been labeled a traitor. So I said, why do I want to even look at him?
Well, right. Like you said so aptly, simply, he messed with the establishment. But then if you take perspective across time, what, 2 or 3 of his modicums were made into U.S. policy. So then there's not
quite a few,
but the change of tide, and
Yeah.
which side of the tennis rally are you on? And for
Right.
how long is the ball in your court?
So Thomas, this discussion this morning has been about my coming back and trying to rediscover why everybody thinks he's such an important poet and why he was kind of the linchpin, the pivot of the 20th century, and he surely was. And Thomas says, I read that he was badly treated post-war, put in a cage, I think, among other things. Yeah, and while he was in the cage, he wrote the Pisan cantos. This cage was in Pisa, and the POW camp he was put into, which is like the POW camp that I ran in Vietnam now, because I was a POW camp commander at one time in Vietnam for several months. And
I won't call you Colonel Klink.
No, I wasn't Colonel Klink. And
no, you were Lieutenant Colonel and stuff.
Yeah, and it was, well, no, I was a first lieutenant then. So I was, I was a peon back then. But anyway, he was put in an open air cage in Pisa for, I think, about 8 months. And so during that 8-month period, he wrote the Pisan cantos. And then in 1946, the Library of Congress, and this had nothing to do with the Bollingen Foundation, other than they used the Bollingen Foundation's money to give this award, but they gave the first Bollingen Prize to Ezra Pound.
Right. So the ball got hit right back over.
And the prize was for the Pisan cantos specifically, interestingly enough.
We'll talk about someone staying the course. So now basically he's put in a cage. So to him, I can lose my discipline. I've been forced to stay in my study. And so what will I do? I will write and I will write and I will write until they open this damn door. But they haven't opened the damn door. So can I have some more paper? So you just talk about not wasting trouble and literally making a diamond out of misfortune.
Yeah.
He just stayed the course.
Right. So, whether it was justifiable to arrest him and not try him for treason, I don't know. Maybe. From a Logos point of view, and I'm trying to contrast my own Logos life, which was all Logos until I was in my mid-30s at least. Lawyer, Marine lawyer, MBA, 5 years of practicing law, that's all Logos. I really detested it. And I've been fighting back against it ever since. Last week when I said goodbye to my girlfriends in the linear accelerator, I said, everything in this room is Logos and it's all dead. The only thing that's alive in this room is the 4 human beings that are here. Okay. So in the 20 seconds or so I got 43 times in my treatment, I somehow influenced these 4 young people. And
congratulations on that and completing the treatment. They opened the cage door.
Yeah. And right. Yeah. Hopefully they did. The result, if you're a young man, make sure you get your prostate exams regularly. And if you're an older man, even more, make sure. But my prognosis now is 10 years, 99% chance of surviving 10 years, and 96% chance of surviving 15 years. And, but that wouldn't be the case if it hadn't been caught early. Right. And
I'm glad they did.
yeah, my doctor told me that his father-in-law had been diagnosed at age 61, and he didn't die until he was 83. And my father had it also, and he lived another 11 years and died of emphysema, not from prostate cancer. Right. His urologist had asked him how long did he want to live, and my father said 30 years. This was when he was 72. And he said 30 years, and the urologist said, well, you won't die of prostate cancer.
Right.
So hopefully they aimed well, and anyway, it's over, thank God.
Well, the radiation artillery, they got to turn the artillery right on you to do some good friendly fire.
Yeah, and there's that was a large give and take, no doubt.
How are you feeling? Is there a resuming recovery, or is there any difference?
There's going to be a recovery for another couple of weeks. It's
okay.
My life is not yet ideal, should I say?
To put it yeah, okay.
And I'm going to allow Big Cat's comment here. Which is, I am reading some of Ezra's quotes. He was a raging anti-Semite. And like Jung, I don't believe he deserves that appellation. And most of the people that knew him well didn't think that was the case. But of course, people who want to diss you will say something like that.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, because to me it's not working around that somehow anti-Semitism is different now than it was then. It's not. But there is back to marketing, frankly. The accusation is worse than the crime.
And yeah, well, that's right.
All you have to do is accuse someone of something, which is absolutely unethical if it's not true. Accuse someone of something, and you take credibility out of the knees long enough for you to get far enough ahead to leave them in the dust. And then the problem is, that turns into, again, the tennis match. And then I recover and get up. Ezra Pound didn't have to recover and get up. He would pretty much probably say, well, I'd engage you in a battle of wits, but I see you're unarmed, so he wouldn't receive those kind of threats. And I think the anti-Semitism there is a very charged threat.
Right.
And
well, Big Cat says the quotes attributed to Ezra are awful. Well, I'm sure they are, but they were also awful to everyone. He picked T.S. Eliot out from obscurity, but throughout this book he refers to T.S. Eliot as possum, right? So you can't tell necessarily what's true and what isn't. And,
well, you get the highbrow Daniel Boone. It's like,
yeah, I mean, it's like me with Jews also, because my classmate is the former president of the World Union of Progressive Jews, and he wrote a wonderful book called Finding Yourself in Biblical Narratives, which at one point I published online. It's now been hacked somehow and it's not available anymore. But anyway,
that sounds like a very individuation book, very Jungian.
Oh yeah, it's very Jungian, and in fact, I liked the book so much that I forget what I was about to do, but I called him up and said, the only way I'm selling any books is in Audible form. So come down to my house and record your book, and I will make sure it gets published audibly, which I did, which meant that I spent about 6 weeks editing the voice, his reading, and that's, if you look that book up on audible.com, it's narrated by Rabbi Stephen Fuchs, but it was edited by Scott Conover, I can tell you, word for word, and that's because all
Stephen, or a PH?
Pardon?
Stephen with a V or a PH?
PH.
Okay.
Stephen.
Okay.
Fuchs, Fuchs. So, so I liked his book so much that I did that. But at the same time, I have some reservations about the behavior of Jews in Israel and vis-a-vis Palestine, really serious ones. And I remember.
Well, I don't find that this next statement fully rectifies it for me, but in tandem agreeing with what you just said there, I'm always more than a little skeptical about someone not at war with someone else disparaging someone else for warring with someone else, because you're picking sides in a battle you have no skin in. Right. And that then is a seed of racism, basically, because you're judging without discernment. The only thing you're discerning for is the next quote you can take out of context to make them look worse. Right. And that's unethical. And I think that's kind of where I try to not drive into anti-Semit, because it's beyond tricky, and it's always going to be charged.
Right. And I got into a discussion with Stevens and some of his congregation because, I don't know, he does a blog, and at one point it was the occasion of the year when they announced that the Jews are the chosen people. Mm-hmm. And I just said, Steve, you got to lighten up on that. We're all chosen, right?
Right.
And that's all well and good for when it was published, but and it kept the Jewish diaspora going for many years. But we have to change that, because we're all chosen. But oh my God, I got attacked for saying that was wrong. And
well, if I modernize the "we're the chosen ones" and I take that statement to translate it into North Texas language, then 5A football, we're number one. That's the same thing as the chosen ones. So there's a very inherent us versus them, instead of an us and them or an us with them. Yeah. And the competition energy in just the verses, just you've spelled out or VS period, and
just pick the Crimson Tide, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Go to
perfect.
Go to Alabama and say that Clemson is better than Alabama this year, and or Clemson is better than the Tide this year, and oh my God, you get zapped.
Well, it's funny that Dean Drummond, who was, I think, dean for 2 years in the architectural program I was in, every time someone brought up, University of Texas or Texas Tech University, and then someone would say, well, UT means under tech. And he would say, so why aren't we talking about Auburn? So,
right. So one more interesting thing about this book, and we're referring today to the letters between Ezra Pound and James Laughlin, who was 30 years younger, and his publisher, is that Laughlin was given an honorary LLD or something like that from Hamilton the year after I graduated from Hamilton. And Ezra Pound went to the campus for that occasion. And the unique thing about it was that he did not say one word at Hamilton. He refused to open his mouth.
And for him, that's a concise message.
Very concise.
For the man of language who around you uses no language, that's like a high insult.
Yeah. So anyway,
yeah, it's basically in parentheses, you can't hear it. It says, "I don't trust you with language."
Right. And Big Cat, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna, that one comment that you made, I'm not going to pass on. And it's just over the top for this conversation. But you know, my point is that I'm in the last 3 weeks going back after over 50 years. I mean, I graduated from Hamilton, you know, over 50 years ago. And so I'm now going back to something that sort of got left in my wake because I was trying to stay alive in the Vietnam War and looking at it, and I'm saying, oh my God, this parallels my own life in many ways. And
you know, I'd like to say too, it's something that just came to me, the revisitation of people that set me off earlier. And it's like when I discovered The Temple and Man by R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, Rennie Lubitsch. And then 10 years after, this is my favorite piece of work. And I discovered he was a fascist. And I had to stop and make the decision, can I make the separation between his personal politics and the architectural work, which actually weren't affected?
Yeah, and so you have to pick and choose. People are complicated beings.
And I think that's where I was going with this, is that history written by the winners, if you're not empathic and inclusive of what was going on in context, not who won. The competition energies are some of the most negative energies around.
Right.
And they scratch out. I mean, there are even hieroglyphs on pyramids and temples that are scratched out for political reasons over the last 2,000 years.
Absolutely. And
you got to read both. And especially if I don't agree with it, I'll dial in, because to me, it's just like when I step in the mediation chamber as an expert witness, well, I need to know me, and I need to know how best to barbecue opposing counsel, but sticking to the truth, you know. So there's that, do I say nothing or do I say, you know, but I need to know the history of both butts and both chairs.
Right. And of course, everybody that's here commenting is commenting on a Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group YouTube channel. And so obviously in the last over 5 years that I've been doing this channel, there have been plenty of the exact same type of libel that was posted about Jung and still is talked about Jung. And, you know, when I started to do my reading group locally, on the fourth session, I immediately got challenged by that. Now, of course, I got challenged by his anti-Semitism and all that stuff. And fortunately, by then, I had been studying Jung for 32 years. And so in the fourth session, I mean, it was the third session when this came up. And in the fourth session, I did my rendition of, you know, Jung's all right. And, you know, we have to realize that people people say certain things at certain times, and maybe they don't actually quite think that.
Well, and also the inflection. You have to honor the inflection and the emphasis of the speaker historically, not recalibrating where the mark goes to inflect.
Right.
And because you can just change the tone of a sentence just by speaking it differently. And that's one of the primary pieces of misquoting, is basically mistranslating how those words are audibly.
Right.
It's a really ninja way to do it. But then you can say, well, it's a direct quote, period. Well, the words are the same, but the way you're inferring the meaning is not the same.
And it reminds me, the Ezra Pound demeanor in 1969 reminds me of this scene in A Bridge Too Far. And the Polish paratrooper general who was in the planning session to go in and save the brigade that had already been put in the middle of a German brigade or some tank brigade, and he's ranting and railing about the fog, which is preventing his paratroopers from going in, and he comments on this one other officer who had been silent. I think it was the weather officer who had been silent during this discussion, and he says, "Your silence is the thunderous," and the fact that Ezra Pound was there on College Hill, and went to Laughlin's investiture as an LLD or whatever it was in 1969 was obviously a respect for Laughlin himself, but he wasn't boycotting Hamilton. He just knew that if he opened his mouth about anything, it would cause a big controversy, and he didn't want to detract from Laughlin's light at that time. And
that's a perfect quote, Skip, from A Bridge Too Far. Your silence is thunderous, because there's that same quote that, the deafening silence of the infinity of a cathedral, and that was absolute respect from him to not steal his fire, basically not go Prometheus and steal his fire.
Right. It was to allow him to have his day and not let whoever would be against him on the Hamilton campus start a big hullabaloo. Then it would have been all about Pound. So
right, and that would have robbed Laughlin, and he respected Laughlin. I mean, that they were kindred brothers, almost brothers from another mother, but just several generations apart.
Yeah,
and which is, I find the age reversal to be basically extremely important, because this isn't someone coming up with Laughlin who's going to, adolescently want to destroy the old guard. He's going to pick and choose who has the content,
Right. Very definitely he did.
Actually, who has said the point and stop.
Yeah. And Laughlin at age 18, who was a Harvard student, had sought, he was visiting Europe, and he had sought Pound out and written him a letter asking for permission to come see him. And so obviously Pound gave him permission, and he stayed a week. And and then Laughlin spent the rest of his life publishing Pound's work. So it was
instant mutual respect, right?
Yeah. And so anyway, I don't Yeah, because it's possible to be a nasty anti-Semite and a great poet. Let me just say that my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he was born in I think it was 1871. Anyway, it was the year of the Little Baker One. And he was in the first class of the Wharton School at Penn. And he spent 50 years on the Pennsylvania Railroad as the internal auditor. And he would ride around Pennsylvania in the caboose of the trains, going from station to station, doing audits of various things, right? And he was absolutely the most bigoted person I ever met. And when I was, I guess I was in the 7th grade, he came to live with us. And he lived with my family and ate dinner with us every night, of course, for 8 years. And then when my father got orders to Japan, he refused to go with us. You know, and which was fine with me.
Right.
But anyway, he and I used to get into horrific rows. You know, and it's the same sort of age dichotomy
Right. Yeah.
that we're seeing now between young people and, you know, older folks who are dumping on this or that, and it has caused the red state blue state. And but he probably made me as liberal as I am because he was so conservative. And you know, I had basically rage against him for many years, but you know, but in the fullness of time, I've gone back and rehabilitated both him and my paternal grandfather.
Right.
And
Which is an admirable feat.
Pardon?
Which is an admirable feat.
Yeah, it's a difficult feat, right? And the reason is that I understood the times when he was living and the sorts of things that were happening in their lives. And you know, Jung was a product of his time, as was Ezra Pound, and you know.
If you look at the trauma, not the treasure of any given time, you quickly find where things are actually rooted.
Yeah. And let's see. And Thomas says, New Directions is a great publishing house without which my reading life would probably have been altered. So kudos to Laughlin. Yeah, and going through this book, and in every letter, they're referring to different people. So I'm halfway through the book, and they've probably made reference to at least 200 of the leading intellectuals of the 20th century. And you know, many of them were great Ezra Pound fans, mainly because Ezra Pound made their careers for them.
Right.
And so, yes, he was an irascible curmudgeon, and if you didn't know him pretty well, he was not somebody you want to know. But on the other hand, you know, he was beloved. And
well, didn't Hemingway even so notably say, in this writing, I'm paraphrasing from memory, in this writing environment, to say you're uninfluenced by Pound means the same thing as you went through the inferno and you said you never got warm.
Yeah, well,
you know,
exactly.
Or you went to the tsunami and you never got wet. I don't know which.
And yes, he did say that. Hemingway did say that.
And that's high honor from
Right.
him, because Hemingway, he the only smoke he blew might be from a pipe,
Yeah.
and he's not going to put it anywhere else. He's telling, he's another Pound. He's going to say it straight up, and you're probably not going to like it at first, even if it's complimentary.
Yeah, mayhaps. And I just look at some of these other literary figures like Thomas Wolfe as an example, and his publisher from Schuster, I forget the man's name, but they did a movie about their relationship, and it's another one that's quite interesting because one of Thomas Wolfe's books, I think it was *The Homeward Angel*, was when he brought it into Simon and Schuster for publication, it was 5,000 pages, and it took him 5 years to edit it so that it could be published.
Right.
And
2.5 Wars and Peace, and I apologize. I'm gonna.
We got to wrap this up today, and
I had that schedule conflict at 9 from my calendar. My apologies.
Yeah, we had agreed to stop at 10:30, and it's 10:38, and we have digressed somewhat from this. But
I think we just drilled deeper. I don't think we digressed. I think
the significance of Jung's work is his influence on culture. It's not about psychology per se, although he was a psychiatrist, but his influence on culture is huge and hasn't been recognized yet.
One thing, I don't know if time today for it, but maybe next week, with the comment about the anti-Semitism, if Nancy is still in the YouTube audience, I would be curious to hear her perspective, because it's always thorough and grounded, but it's compassionate with empathy, but with truth. So there can be some salt in a wound, but I always find it to be very wise salt in a wound.
Yeah. Well, if you want to hear Nancy's wisdom, please join our advanced reading group where she's a member. Because I think that she wouldn't want some of the things she says to be made public. And
that's a very good point.
And that's the advanced reading group. While I record the sessions, they have not been published except to the group itself. And
I'll contact her too, because I would love her perspective to see what she thinks about that, because it feels like there's an approach missing, and I kind of feel she might.
Well, I'm sort of doubtful that she's familiar with Ezra Pound at all, because her life has been different.
I think just the racism piece, the anti-Semit, just conceptually from her experience, of what's her swivel head, what's she's seen and across the years. So, but yeah, I'm gonna need to get going, and
I'll save the news about our confluence for our private conversation, because there is news. It relates to this, but I don't want to spoil the surprise.
Okay, just throw some food in the bag, that way the cats don't starve before we get to Wednesday.
All right, so peace everyone. Thank you for being